and they are all just dedicated. They're all
I only
dedicated.
see you on
We do our best
Facebook,
to
so
treat
here
them,
you are in
you know,
person.
as
Y'all, I
well,
rarely.
there's no like hierarchy. Like I don't sit, you know, as the managing editor. I'm not like sitting in some ivory tower. Like
So thank you everyone for joining us today. So my name is Zabdi Salazar and I'm the Director of Business Operations for The Contemporary, which was founded here at Trinity University in 2016. And just to give a bit of an overview of who we are a student-run digital publication whose goal is to empower collegiate journalists to report on important issues in their communities. And so tonight we're very excited about hosting this panel, which is News Diversified, How Different Perspectives Shape the Newsroom. And I am very excited also to introduce our panel speakers, which are Francisco Vara-Orta from Chalkbeat. We have Graham Watson-Ringo from the Rivard Report, and Elaine Ayala from the San Antonio Express News. So first, can the panelists just briefly give a bit more background about themselves, and then we'll start off with our first question.
Okay, this microphone system is pretty awesome. I feel like I'm in a huge auditorium. It's just crazy. Well, I've been in the business now for 38 years. I started my first job as a reporter at the Corpus Christi Caller-Times, and I've worked at 6 papers altogether, and the longest tenure I've ever had is here at home at the Express News, where I've been a features editor, and a Metro reporter, and now sort of a hybrid where I cover faith and other issues like immigration, plus I write a column.
Sorry. I didn't plan for this very well. My name's Graham, and I am the managing editor at the Rivard Report, which is a nonprofit
A little bit farther away.
news organization. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm gonna get the thing here. I started my San Antonio career with the Express News, right alongside Elaine here, and then moved over to the Rivard Report about 3 months ago. Previously, most of my journalistic work was in sports, working for outlets such as Yahoo and ESPN. So, thanks for having me.
So I'm Francisco Vara-Orta, and I am currently this reporter at Chalkbeat, a national correspondent and data specialist for them. I started my career here 17 years ago at La Prensa, which is a community newspaper that's now undergone a change with, now they're La Prensa Texas, and they're different leadership. So I worked at a community newspaper that was bilingual. Started out when I was 17, and so got to slowly know some of the Express News people. I went to the LA Times after a couple of internships in Austin and Laredo, where I covered breaking news and various beats, whatever they needed. During the recession, I was laid off, and I wound up at 2 business publications, which was interesting, covering real estate and manufacturing and trucking, which you look at me and maybe I'm not like the first person you think would cover that, but it was a blue-collar beat and felt pretty close to my roots. Then I came back to San Antonio, and I got to work with Elaine. She was one of my editors at the Express News covering education, and ended up going to grad school at the University of Missouri, working for IRE, which is the Investigative Journalism Association that puts on a lot of trainings, which I highly recommend. And then wound up at EdWeek in Washington, D.C., and just recently joined Chalkbeat. So I made the transition from business publications, community publications, to corporate, to now nonprofit. And there's a lot of pros and cons in these models for people of color and for women. So I'm excited to talk about them and to hold the systems a little accountable through our experiences. And those are the people we love that we worked alongside, and some of which aren't with us anymore and working because of some of those conditions.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. As you can see, they have an array of experiences and background that we're excited to learn more about. And so first, according to The Atlantic, only 13% of newspaper reporters are minorities, despite the fact that minorities are over 37% of the U.S. population. Although there have been many efforts by news organizations to promote diversity and inclusion, there are still many disparities with the makeup of newsrooms and the angle of stories in the media. So first, I want to ask a question. Considering your extensive experience in the industry, how have y'all seen newsrooms change over time? And we want to begin with Elaine, since she's had more than 33 years in the industry.
38.
Or 38, yeah.
Who's counting?
Right.
So they've changed dramatically several times. And at first, I have to say that there were some newspapers, and there's probably still some today, that have 0 people of color. They're usually small, they're in smaller communities, not in urban centers. They're weeklies, they're monthlies. In most urban places, however, I think statistics will show anything from 8% to as high as 17%. That seems high to me. The Express News used to be way higher than that, and in the 30s, in fact. It probably doesn't reflect that now, since we've lost so many people and people of color. But when I first started in journalism, it showed. I was one of 2 at one paper. I was the only Latina and the first Latina ever, and that was at the Cleveland Plain Dealer in Ohio. And I was treated like a princess there because I was the only one. But in lots of places, you were left to be the representative of all people of color, and thus you were asked, whenever there was a story, you were asked to do it. And there were some journalists of color that resented that. I wasn't among them. I have always covered communities of color and gladly have done it and viewed it as my purview and my beat. And even when I do faith or immigration or whatever I'm called upon to do, I do a diversity of sources. So another thing that has changed over time is how we cover communities, and the sensitivity towards that has grown as well. I remember, I told this story to you, but I remember just cringing at the Corpus Christi Caller-Times in my very first job, because they would have headlines that said, "Mexican arrested" or "Mexican killed." And then I'd read in the story, and it's somebody who lives in town, and he's 42, and he's lived here all his life. But for the headline writer, he was Mexican. And no story, the content of the story did not say that he was a Mexican national, whether he lived in Corpus Christi or elsewhere, but it was the way that that group was described. I remember thinking, God, we won one for the team when stories began saying "man arrested," because the default in all stories was when white people, white men, were arrested or killed. It would just say "man arrested or killed." It didn't say "Mexican arrested or killed." The descriptors only came when it was people of color. So all that's changed, right? We're more sensitive to these things, although there are those things that pop up that just shock you because of how something was treated. Also, I think what's happened over time is that news corporations became more sensitive to the diversity issue and really set out in the 80s especially and into the 90s to recruit. And as I recall then, all the journalism conferences where the job fair was tremendous. I mean, you were walking up to booth after booth after booth, and they wanted your resume. They wanted to interview you. They were there to hire. We all know that the newspaper industry is in decline, and that has all gone away. Although I did notice that in the last NHJ, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists conference, there was more of a job fair. So, and as I told you, that the good news for young reporters, photographers, journalists, is that if there are going to be any hires, you're going to be it. Because I'm retiring, people like me are retiring, or if there are layoffs, guess who they lay off first, or among those big groups. And so you will be an easier hire, you will be cheaper to pay, and so there should be great opportunities for you in the field. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that what I've seen over time is also a great interest in building diversity of sources among all journalists, viewing it as good journalism to speak to a variety of people. And I remember that there were a lot of us, journalists of color, who made it a point, like if we were going to do a story about property tax rates going up, we're going to include that Chicano in there, because they pay property taxes too. So, but over time, I've seen more of an interest to include in all kinds of stories a diversity of sources: women, men, people who are Black, people who are Muslim. And the other thing I see now is a great interest in those smaller communities of colors, among Muslims, among other groups, that where people are more journalists are paying attention to those smaller groups that don't get enough coverage.
Thank you, Elaine. And I know, Graham, you said that the Rivard Report also has a policy in terms of diversifying their news. Can you explain more about that background in the Rivard Report's mission?
Well, it's not an official policy, but we are very cognizant of the communities that we cover. And we want to be representative to those communities. We want to be able to accurately portray those communities and the people in those communities. So, we require our reporters to find multiple sources. We don't ever do a one-source story, and we encourage them to find diverse sources to tell different facets of the story, because one person from one background may have one version of events, where another person from another background may see the exact same thing totally differently. And so I think it's important to be able to be well-rounded as a journalist, as a publication, to be able to show people that while it may be a story that could skew one way or the other, there's always multiple facets to that story. In terms of my background with what I've seen in terms of the change in journalism, as I mentioned before, most of my background comes in sports, and sports is one of those places where it's not diverse at all. I started and I didn't realize that until I got into a bigger stage. I started at the Dallas Morning News, and at that point, their sports department had more than 100 people, their sports department. And it was all over the place. You had pretty much every ethnicity and, male, female. It was a pretty nice ratio from management to reporters, copy editors, and that. Went on to the Post-Dispatch in St. Louis to go back and cover my alma mater, also Mizzou, and found that also a very diverse place, because St. Louis is a pretty diverse place. So my sports editor was one of the few Black sports editors in the entire country. At that point in time, he was one of 4 in the entire country. He has since gone on to ESPN, and he does, if you watch any NBA coverage, he is behind the scenes creating that coverage, anything you watch on TV for that. So when I moved to ESPN, and I got more regimented in what I was doing, which was college football, I quickly realized that there were not a whole lot of people who looked like me. Same thing at Yahoo. I was the only, for a very long period of time, I was the only woman on the sports staff, period, at Yahoo. And Yahoo's a huge company. I was definitely the only person of color on the staff. It was exclusively white males. And it was so strange in terms of the writing staff. The editorial staff was a little more diverse. And by little more, I mean there was one Black guy who was on there. So there were 2 of us. And so that opened my eyes quite a bit, because what I was seeing in newsrooms was also what I was seeing in press boxes. There was not diversity. There were not people of color. There were not women. Even covering, so I'm covering these sports that are mostly played by people of color, and they're almost exclusively being covered by white men. And at one point in time when I was covering Missouri with a whole host of white men, the coach of the Missouri football team at the time had a special meeting just about me, so that his players didn't talk to me because I was a Black female and they felt the need to talk to me. This was then reported back to me by the players, who thought it was all pretty ridiculous, because those were not the same rules that were in place for the men, who were also, using the same, reporting strategies that I was. And that happened time and time again. There were always different rules for me. There were always, PR people who had to sit in my interviews, where they didn't sit in on anybody else's interviews. There was always somebody lingering behind me as I'm asking my questions, because heaven forbid I ask somebody for their phone number. And if I did ask somebody for somebody's phone number, what did that mean? Did that mean I wanted to go out with the guy, or am I just trying to cultivate a source? So, and this is a story as old as time for women in sports journalism, is that you can't do the things that you need to do to be a competent reporter, anything any other reporter would do, without there being some underlying cause for it, without there being a reason, well, why are you talking so closely to that person? You have to be very conscious of what you're wearing, very conscious of how you say things, very conscious of how close you are to the person. Very conscious of asking for a phone number, asking, can I contact you later? Because you don't want that to be misconstrued in any sort of way. Whereas these are not challenges for men in sports. They don't care what they say. And so that was a challenge. It was even more of a challenge because I had nobody to talk to about it. I had nobody to look to, nobody to share my experiences with, especially as a younger reporter. And I think that's what helped spur me into a more managerial role, because I didn't have anybody above me that I could say, hey, this just happened to me, can we talk about it, how do I handle this? You know, as a reporter in my 20s, not knowing where to go or how to approach things. And I think that's what kind of swayed me toward management when I went to Yahoo, because I wanted to equip myself so that when a younger generation of people, and it didn't have to be sports, it was journalism in general, females, people of color who were facing challenges, they didn't look around and go, well, who can I talk to about this? Like, I can talk to my peers and maybe they share some of the experiences, but who authoritatively can I talk to help me get through this problem? And so that was a glaring rut that I saw, and it's still there. You know, we've tried to address it. We, as NABJ, which is the National Association of Black Journalists, have tried to really, we hold a lot of media corporations accountable for their hiring practices, and we try to lobby them to make diverse hires, and that's in all facets. And we're a ways behind, and so, you know, I take on mentorships. I reach out to younger reporters whom I either encounter at, you know, conventions, or who reach out to me, and I've made myself as accessible as possible because I understand what it's like to be in that position and have nobody to look to if something happens in your reporting or in your field that, you know, you need to talk to somebody about. So that's kind of what has shaped me and where I've seen the business kind of change in my time.
Well, thank you. And Francisco, do you have also some experiences you'd like to share, and how Chalkbeat has also exercised more effort into diversifying the newsroom?
Sure, yeah. So in the more immediate, the organization I work for is 33% journalists of color. And the industry as a whole is, as Elaine noted, about 12 to 17%. And so you can't have quotas due to law, but you can be intentional in your practice of like where you go to recruit. I worked in newsrooms where my colleagues were asked, do you know anyone else at Harvard that we could recruit? Or someone else from the network. And it was interesting that it wasn't until I went to my master's program at Mizzou, because I went to St. Mary's here in town, the network that opened up, and the pedigree that comes with. And I couldn't really do it for personal or professional reasons until I was later in my career, and I think it's given me a second life, because I think I was near thinking it's time to leave the field, right? And so my experiences are more coded. They are built off the backs of the experiences that the two women here on the panel have had, where I think corporate managers learn how to handle stories a certain way or put them in certain places. Certainly you see the numbers are where I started, because for me, and I think for a lot of us, it's an emotional issue. And it can feel, it's our livelihood. We get into this because we care about the communities we cover, the stories we're telling. And so as I started to map out what was happening, I started to understand the past 15 years of my career and how it intersected with this. And I came of age in this industry at a time when now we're talking about a lot of intersectionality. And so, here we have 2 women of color, I'm a gay man of color. And so I would go to the Gay Journalists Association, it's all white men. I would go sometimes to the Latino journalists earlier on in my career, and I wasn't one of the boys. And you could clearly feel that, and who was invited where and to what, and how they gathered sometimes. So it's like I always joke, there's one battle in the newsroom you fight, and then there's one outside to get the story. And that's the one we're more comfortable talking about, not what's going on inside. But it is killing us. I mean, we are shrinking, we are becoming more irrelevant. So I started to look, more and more at the numbers as I thought, if I'm going to talk to my white peers about this, I have to be the most prepared in the room with information. And so the premier study that we all cite is the Association of the American Society of News Editors, which has been doing diversity surveys since 1978. And if you ever read folks like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's always citing Ida B. Wells as an example of the kind of journalism we should be doing, look into your history. So I wanted to read this excerpt about kind of, to put in context, this study that we all rely on to get our diversity numbers with this association. This was during they had an annual convention in 1954 when schools were desegregated, and they allowed quote unquote outspoken racists to speak there. The association defended the decision because granting quote white supremacists an audience was mandated by the First Amendment, even though the convention was not a public forum, and that including such views maintained the organization's political neutrality and journalistic objectivity, even though proponents of integration were not given time on the program as well. That organization, when founded in 1922, did not admit its first non-white member until the 1960s, and didn't see a woman or black person elected president until 1987 and 1993. That's the organization that we all rely on for the best diversity data in our industry to make our case. And think about how all that's baked in over time. And a lot, I think, has changed from that on the surface. But when you keep looking at the numbers, you have to keep questioning why, and it gets more and more uncomfortable. So you look at it today, and now the survey is being conducted by a black woman, one of my favorite academians, Meredith Clark. She's at the University of Virginia. She was just at UNT. And she had to postpone the release of the information this year because only 14% of newsrooms responded. So what does that say? And that's kind of why I decided to dedicate my thesis work at the University of Missouri to embrace it, because I came of an age where I had people tell me, don't touch race, don't bring it up, don't take those stories. Even journalists of color, they didn't want me pigeonholed. And white editors that did care for me, I felt, and were worried I was gonna get pigeonholed. And an example I learned from Elaine was to embrace those stories, because you're trained just like everyone else, and you start to develop an imposter syndrome. And so I think it's important to just note that and to remember that we hear a lot of we can't find the talent. And it was just keep this in mind. The number of non-white journalists between 2007 and 2015 in US newsrooms dropped from 7,400 to 4,200. So we lost 3,000 journalists of color during the recessionary period in our industry. That's the lowest it's been since 1989. So it's important for us to know our history. It was important for me to know my history, to know why is this still a problem, and that it's not emotional. This is an actual problem. It's not just how we feel, but it manifests every day in the newsrooms and the headlines we choose, and who gets promoted, what stories make it on the front page or at the beginning of the telecast. And all the research shows that it's still a preference towards the white reader. And so I think that's the importance of now in hindsight, I look at an organization like La Prensa, which people thought was a very scrappy publication, and I view it totally different now in how that voice was so important. And I think that as more of us start to get this formalization in the field, whether joining IRE or becoming investigative journalists or becoming second generation college students, this is shifting, but it's not, as you can see through all these numbers, it's never been an easy battle. We're still scared to look in the mirror. And so I think that that's something that we try to do at Chalkbeat, and we did at Ed Week, but even at Ed Week, I was the only Latino. And so it's not every day I have someone coming up and shredding the Mexican flag in front of me and saying, go back. That's not how it manifests itself. It's residual, and it's baked into the culture, and it's just like getting questions like, do we use Latinx or not? And it's like, I can't represent the entire Latino community and give an authoritative, stance on that. And I just discounted my experiences, and I saw my colleagues discount them so much that they gave up and left. And so that survivor's guilt, I think, a little drives me to talk about this more openly. And I look at these two women here, and I'm like, if they can do it, I can do it. And so I think my experience is a little different. I'm still kind of in shock some days about how we all made it, because only I think 11% of all managers are journalists of color, and that's all combined. That's who participates. So think about who doesn't. Half of the industry doesn't. At this point, 80% doesn't want to.
And the parity goal for that organization was that by the year 2000, we would reach parity. That's when we would, and this was established back in the 70s, that by the year 2000, we would surely reach the point where all our newsrooms were going to reflect, going to mirror our communities. And they got nowhere close to it. And now they busted the deadline, and then they gave themselves another 20 or 25 years to reach parity, which if this is the rate of getting there, it's going to take a lot longer.
Thank you, Elaine. I also want to go more in depth into reporting on minority communities. I read an NPR article lately of how the Latinx community is usually seen in the media under a single lens, immigration, and how they're usually portrayed as undocumented Mexicans. Many argue that minorities are usually stereotyped by the media. And what do you think can be done about this, and how such portrayal of minority communities really affects people's lives?
The dominant narrative about immigration affects, it's sort of, for as much as we do it, and it's important, it is how Latino communities are viewed, as if every Latino community is an immigrant community. And we know in Texas that the border changed, so there were a lot of people of Mexican origin who became U.S. citizens, and it's true for generations of families. So for them to be seen, and we're by this president, they are seen as everyone is Mexican, and all of us sort of fall under this banner, has been a dominant narrative. So how we combat that, is by, well, you have to ask. I always ask how people want to be described, and they want to be described as a Mexican American, as a Tejano, as a Chicano, as a Latino. I really haven't heard Latinx very much among my sources. I think it's a California thing, but it'll make its way over here. It's important to ask and then to reflect that in our stories. And what I think the Express News strives to do, and several other newspapers I've worked for, is to make that definition broader, to make that narrative broader, so that we're not seen as only that lens. And I hope you see it reflected in the stories. I think what we see on networks often is when we are covered, it is because of the immigration.
Right.
That's why I love seeing our Congressman Castro appear on CNN, and he's talking about, the Israeli conflict or Mideast policy or the budget, or that's a very powerful image and very powerful words to see a Latino at such level describing and talking about issues that are worldly and not solely on immigration. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. And also, Francisco, you also had a interesting conversation more about how the Latinx culture is not so monolithic and how there are critical differences. Can you share a bit more about your outlook of how the Latino community has been portrayed in the media?
Well, yeah, I mean, building off of Elaine's answer, I think if we had had more Latinos in management, I think the election could have been affected in 2016. I think that the rhetoric of when Trump came down that escalator and said what he said, I remember talking to some of my white colleagues and they said, he will never win now. That is political suicide. And I was like, look into the Texas Rangers on the border. And I really feel like a lot of this it's not shocking to us, but I think for a while we were made to feel like we were crazy when we would bring it up. And so that
Or too sensitive.
yeah, they were too sensitive, that we need to let it go. I value the perspectives of my colleagues from backgrounds that I am not, whether they're a woman or they're Jewish, or they come from a different income level, or they're an immigrant, I'm third generation, because there's privileges I have, that I don't have to worry about things, and that gives me blinders. And I think that that's just a conversation you have to have in a newsroom. And as far as with the Latino culture, I think that what the mainstream, corporate media doesn't understand is how different Puerto Ricans are from Cubans, from amongst Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexican Americans, their experience of those that are immigrants versus those that have been here a few generations. There's tensions amongst us for different reasons because there's colorism, and that's an issue. There's anti-Blackness. There's an Afro-Latino community that doesn't get covered always as well or as thoughtfully. And on top of that, you have in the Mexican community, which is really important for this area and this demographic to keep in mind, that we have had a push and pull with federal policy in being accepted and being kicked out over 150 years. And sometimes we're good enough to be accepted by mainstream America, and other times our brownness is a threat. And so I think that understanding that history is really important. To me, it makes it less emotional. It's just the fact. There was Operation Wetback, and people don't want to say that on TV. That's what Donald Trump was saying when he lauded Eisenhower's policies. And I didn't see anyone really at the national level put that word out there because it makes everyone uncomfortable and it's unsavory, but that's federal policy. And so when you see the echoes of the sentiment of the support behind it, the fear, the ethnocentrism, it goes back to those kinds of attitudes. And so those of us that have lived it because our grandparents lived it, you hear these things and they register with you. So for me, that press conference was like, no, that's not political suicide. He's on to something that's gonna make sense as anyone who studied demography. Like, do we think, like in America's history, have we ever fully accepted change? I mean, we relied on the Supreme Court to integrate schools. We have relied on them all the way to give people like me marriage rights. So I think that you have to look at these communities and realize that policy generation to generation will change. And with Texas Latinos, a lot of times what I deal with outside of this market is trying to explain why there are so many Mexican American Republicans. And understanding under Reagan there was a Bracero program. And so there's a loyalty to the Republican Party that a lot of them now are questioning because of the rhetoric of Trump. And these are just conversations I never hear on CNN.
Oh, yeah. One of our reporters at the paper became a citizen after Ronald Reagan's big, people called it amnesty, but it was immigration reform. It was the first big effort to reform antiquated law. And he became a Republican because his family was so loyal to this president that made this citizenship possible. And now the Trump presidency has vanquished that loyalty in that family because it's gone to so extreme. I wanted to mention one thing that I should have mentioned in the first round of questions is that prior to '09, when we had our big release of so many people got laid off at the Express News, but about 6 years prior to that, The Express News brought the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education to San Antonio and brought this panel of teachers, other journalists, mostly of color, to conduct this audit of our newspaper from within. So many studies will tell the newspaper industry, you're only 17%, you're way behind, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. And there are some newspapers that will say, wait a minute, we do much better than that. We're doing way better than the national average. Well, we considered ourselves a very diverse newspaper that had diverse sources, that was very careful about including people in our paper. So we took a random week, just picked out randomly, and they took like 50 of us out of our jobs for a week. We were so big then that 50 of us came out of our jobs, and we participated in an audit of our own paper. So we literally counted every story, counted who the sources was, counted the faces and photographs, counted how many of the sources are men and women, how many of them were from the north side or the south side or the west side or the east side, whether they were of a certain age group, whether, because we knew these sources, we intimately knew these people. It wasn't a survey done elsewhere. We knew más o menos, they lived on the north side, they're professional, they're middle class or upper middle class. So when we got the results of the audit that we collected the data for, some of us were not shocked, but many people were shocked, and they were, this can't be true. We put Latinos on page 1 all the time. But what we found in the fine print is, by and large, we were talking to white men who came from a certain class, who came from one part of town. Guess what part of town they came from? And that we weren't, while we did have stories about Latinos and blacks and others in the community, the greatest majority of our stories, those that described major events in town, were limited to those experts, those people that were most trusted by us to quote over and over again, and they were white, male, from the north side, either middle or upper middle class.
Wow, that's very interesting. And I want to segue into a more serious topic discussion. I know that, Graham, you shared a very interesting story with me about discrimination that you faced in the newsroom. Can you share with us that story as well?
Yeah. So it wasn't in a newsroom per se, but I was actually partaking in a managerial fellowship, which was a diversity fellowship. So everybody on the panel was, or everybody who had been picked as either, a person of color or a woman. And this was in an effort to, create new leaders, diverse leaders. And one of our, they flew us out to Indianapolis. We studied at the University of Indiana. And one of our projects was to go to an Indianapolis Colts game. And then from there, once the game was over, we were supposed to, pretend like we were directing coverage of some sort. So 2 of the women who were with me were on the younger side, and I said, you know what, you've never been in an NFL press conference, you've never been in an NFL locker room, let's go downstairs and see how that goes. Little background on that. Most people don't know that NFL locker rooms, much like NBA locker rooms, much like MLB locker rooms, are open. Anybody can go in from the media. There's no rules, these guys are going about their business. They're showering, they're changing, they're dealing with, whatever it is they're dealing with. And you, as a reporter, man, woman, indifferent, are just there to do your job. But there's a lot of stuff going on. And my first experience with it was in college, and I was in the St. Louis Rams locker room, and it blew my mind. But, after a while, you get old and you get used to it. So we'd gone to the press conference for the quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars, Blake Bortles. And after his press conference was over, he exited. So when you do press conferences, you only get like 1 or 2 guys. But sometimes those guys aren't the crux of your story. So you need to go into the locker room. And it's pretty typical to go to the press conference and then go to the locker room, or just go to the locker room. we started to go out the door to the locker room, and an older gentleman who was an usher stepped in front of us. And I said, excuse me, we're trying to get to the locker room. He goes, why would you think you get to go to the locker room? And we had press passes on, we were dressed appropriately, and I was like, because we're members of the media and we get to go in the locker room. And he goes, you don't get to go to the locker room. You're not allowed in the locker room, and there's nothing you need to see in that locker room. And I said, and the two women behind me were like, I guess we don't go into the locker. I'm like, no, that's not how this works. I'm like, since the 70s, women have been allowed in the locker room, and too many women have fought way too hard to get the right to go into the locker room, just like the men, for you to stand here and tell me I can't go. And he's like, well, I'm just gonna have to ask somebody about that. So we stood there while he went and asked somebody, and a PR guy for the Jaguars walked by and he goes, what are you guys doing? I'm like, we're trying to get to the locker room and this guy won't let us go. And he's like, oh my God, oh my God. He's like, open the door, let them in. Everybody is allowed in the locker room. What are you doing? And the guy was like, well, I didn't feel like they needed to see what was going on in the locker room. And I'm like, you're not my dad. Like, it was just a very weird situation. And then this is where it turned badly. I didn't handle it the best. So I took to Twitter and vented my frustration. The other women who were involved also vented their frustration. A gentleman who was also in our fellowship, who was a gay man, also vented his frustration and said, you know, are they gonna keep me out because I'm gay? And it became a big thing where the NFL had to publicly apologize to us. And the Colts had to publicly apologize to us. But then you get the wrath of the no-name, no-face people on social media. And this lasted days. And it was everything from, what are you trying to see in there? Why do you have to be in there? To, I know where you live and I will come kill you. To, you know, look at her children. I bet you we can figure out where they go to school. I found her on Facebook. You know, I know where she lives. It got pretty scary. Had to, you know, I had security from my company, because my company became very intense about it. So I had security put on me. I had all my emails filtered to security. All my social media accounts were closed down and taken over. So that's, and it wasn't just you're a woman and you're not welcome. You're a black person and you're not welcome to cover a sport that's predominantly black. You are, how dare you even question that you would ever be able to do the same kind of thing as a man would be able to do. And, you know, a lot of professional organizations came to our defense, and this, you can look all this up, a lot of people wrote about it. But it was really like the first time that it was put in the spotlight that women go into locker rooms, women do the same types of jobs that men do. You just don't, you know, nobody likes to think about how these stories get put together, but it, you know, it takes a lot of work and there's a lot of stuff that goes on. And once people went, whoa, 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 women are allowed in men's locker rooms? This can't be right. Well, it's been like that since the 70s. Where were you then? You know, like, it's on the flip side, it was always like, well, all the men, are the men allowed in the women's locker room? That's always the way they flip it. And having worked in the WNBA for 2 years, no, except in the playoffs. And it's a similar rule as colleges. Colleges don't allow people in the locker rooms until the playoffs or you know, the NCAA tournament or the college football playoff or whatever championship you're covering. And that is a source of contention for men, which is you know, kind of plays into that argument that there needs to be, you know, some sort of balance there. If we as women require to go into men's locker rooms, then yes, there's probably an argument to be made there that men should be required to go into, or allowed to go into women's locker rooms. But it became quite the debate, and you know, I didn't love being at the center of it, but it was an important debate to have about how journalists are journalists, and if you are a professional, you are there to do your job no matter what is hanging around you. My good friend Joan Neeson, who writes for Sports Illustrated, went on a big Twitter rant just a couple days ago about this very thing, that everybody is staring at her in a locker room and she's just trying to do her job. and everybody is wondering what she's doing, why she's doing it, what she's asking, and we're under constant microscopes. And it's so much more difficult to operate in that little space that society and that journalists, and male journalists too, have put women in. That it makes it so much more difficult. We have to be so much better at our jobs. We have to be so much better at the questions we ask. Because a coach is quick to point out that, oh, you never played the game. Well, half the men never played the game. But it's always, you always have to be at the very top of your game. And that goes for whether you're a person of color, whether you're a female, or, you are always questioned. There's never just an opportunity where you can just go about your business, and if you screw up on something, oh my gosh, you are the dumbest person in the whole world, and da-da-da. Doesn't matter if a male screwed up on the same thing. And so there's definitely a double standard there that's hard. It creates a level of pressure in this business that a lot of people can't take. That's why you don't see a lot of females in sports journalism, at least not as many as you do, as much as you see the males. And it's worse now with social media, with this empowerment that has come with our current president, these faceless trolls, and they come in waves, and they come in groups, and they come very, very harshly. And it's scary. I've had friends that have literally been scared out of the business because of just the immense pressure that is put on them to always be at the very, very top of their game, always be conscious of everything they're wearing, and heaven forbid you mention the wrong thing. Or, one of my good friends, I think she was the one who asked Peyton Manning about retirement, and Twitter was nonstop for a week against her, because how dare she ask Peyton Manning if he is going to retire? He is a Super Bowl winning quarterback. You don't know anything about anything. And that very quickly turns from you don't know anything about anything to I am going to find you and kill you. It's amazing how quickly you can go from that to I will find you and kill you. I know where your kids go to school. I know where you live. I know what street you live on. I know your neighbors. I know what time you get home from work. It gets scary. I don't face those kinds of situations in management much. But, at work right now, we're going through a situation where there is a reporter who's reporting a very controversial story, and he's starting to get a little worried about that kind of stuff. It's amazing the lengths people will go to protect their ideals, to protect their small little space of what they believe in. And I think that goes the same for us too. I mean, we're trying to fight for equality, and it's hard to break people's beliefs, but sometimes those people take them to the extreme, much to the detriment of, the business, civility, and it's almost exclusively targeted at women and people of color. Just a little side note, there's a sports site called Barstool Sports that is currently in the media because it has a leader that endorses rape under certain circumstances, and he thinks it's okay, and he encourages his followers to be okay with these things. He encourages his followers to call both men and women who disagree with him certain names, and then if a woman, heaven forbid, mentions this Barstool Sports on social media, his group will come at these women in waves, and it is a horrifying experience for women. So much so that the Daily Beast just wrote a long story about it, which was followed up by New York Magazine all in the last couple days. And, women have been decrying this site for its misogynistic ways, and only now when two white men have something to say about it are people going, well, maybe we as advertisers shouldn't support a group that does that. And these people have been around for years. And women all over have just been scared to death, scared literally to death, women journalists, scared to death because these people are so feel so empowered and feel like it is their right to say, their motto is Saturdays are for the boys. And heaven forbid a woman have an opinion. So these are the challenges that we face even today in modern day society, and it's horrifying, but it's also kind of inspiring that some of these women keep going and they keep doing their jobs and they keep fighting, knowing that there are perilous situations, and they put themselves and their families in danger. And it shouldn't be that way. It's just journalism.
Wow, thank you, Graham, for sharing those stories and all the challenges that journalists have faced so far, especially women and people of color. I also wanted to say, despite all of these challenges, can y'all briefly give the audience what hope there is for a lot of these people, especially since it's currently really hard? Can y'all just share that? And then we'll segue into the question and answer period where you could so you start thinking about any questions you might want to ask the panelists. And so, but first, if y'all could just do short 30 seconds, and then we could segue into the Q&A.
Well, I think the good news is that you're probably getting the knowledge of doing a lot of things more. You're not the traditional reporter, you're not the traditional editor, you're doing video, you're doing podcasts, you're learning to do all of that. And that will prepare you for the newsroom today, what they expect of us. Some of us do it with more skill than others, because some of us have been writing. I use paper and pen a lot of times and take interviews over the phone. So you'll be more prepared to walk into a modern newsroom. I think the other benefit is that you're young and you don't earn as much as people that have been in the business for 30 years. You may not get the kind of benefits that older journalists have received. So you're going to get an opportunity. What I worry about your generation of journalists is that that your salaries will remain flat, and that newsrooms are flat in terms of opportunity. You're not going to, there were so many more positions that you could aspire to when I came into the journalism, that you could aspire to be this kind of editor or that kind of reporter, or after you paid your dues on doing all of this, you could, and what I see now is a huge flatness in the newsroom. So that's going to be harder to sustain your growth. So if you are committed to journalism, you're going to have to find creative ways to give yourself new experiences, new assignments, kind of self-promote. And you do that by keep working on education. I mean, there are so many ways that you can go to seminars, that you can enhance your skills, that you can apply for fellowships that will give you those advantages.
And come to events like these to share about what these other people already learned. And Francisco, do you have any other thoughts to share?
Sure. So as far as bright spots, I mean, yeah, a lot of this is like doom and gloom, and we really should not lose sight of the good that's happening. There are several newspapers and news organizations that are unionizing, and this is not a political statement on whether unions, in the general sense, because I cover teachers, so I have to always be careful about some of that. But in the sense of kind of like the newspaper industry, the reason we've gone back to them is because of the income inequality that's really affected newsrooms and required a lot of first-generation journalists, college students that want to be journalists or are journalists and were first-generation college students to leave the field, because it's like, why did you go through all this and then just end up in poverty again? And so, we have a lot of journalists of color leading the movement at the Los Angeles Times, the Virginian Pilot, Slate. If you look, it's mostly led by a lot of women of color, even though they're only 7% of the industry. But as usual, the women of color are carrying it for the rest of us. So that's a bright spot. IRE, which is I was in the elevator with them on their staff when we were in New Orleans, which this is a bad thing for liability, because the whole staff was in this freight elevator moving boxes, and if something had happened, the whole staff would have been dead. But so we really weren't thinking about this. But I looked around, I was the only person of color, and I was afforded a space to talk about that because they asked me, and it just didn't dawn on me because there were a lot of women, and the investigative journalism world has had a hard time, I think, embracing women, that we don't view femininity as strong. And so women deal with it, effeminate gay men deal with it. And so I feel like I wasn't ever looked at always because of that, because of the way I dressed or because of my vocal tone. And so just creating spaces there about that, like, you don't have to be slamming the phone down and like breaking shit in your office to like seem like you're an aggressive reporter. You can do it very quietly.
Exactly.
In fact, that unassuming nature really can help, and that's something that those of us on the other end have had to learn to deal with, the systems of power, with them on their personalities. So IRE is doing a lot of work. We have a president who's Cheryl Thompson. She's a black woman who's a professor and an investigative reporter at the Washington Post. And she's partnering with Doug Haddix, who's a white man from the Midwest, but really believes in this cause. And I think that that's important too, those partnerships. When I did a task force with the education journalist group that I'm a part of, I made sure to put white people on the panel. And they told me how much it enlightened them to things that they didn't think about. And the conversations were really rich and they were really engaging. And that's what happens in the editing process when you have people from different perspectives coming together. So there's more work that we're doing to get a base of data to figure out where are we at on these things and where do we go. There's no good data on queer journalists. So we're collecting that information. And I think with the silver lining with Trump, with the Me Too movement, with the Capitol Gazette massacre, we now have spaces to talk about this stuff. We are not crazy, we are not emotional. This is real, this has come home to roost, and if we want our, democratic republic to survive, we need to have these conversations. And in a weird way, like as hard as it is sometimes in newsrooms, we have arrived there, and we do have some agency. And I think that the nonprofit model is an area where you're seeing more people of color in management. It's more flat, it's less of a hierarchy. I remember the immense fear I had going to top editors to ever talk to them in newspapers. I can Slack message my founder at Chalkbeat, and it's okay. And that creates more of an agency there. And they want to hear my ideas. Just today they were asking me about some racial data that we were dealing with, and some of the people of color in the room, they valued that opinion. But we've had so many conversations leading up to that, I didn't feel like I was pigeonholed into it. It's also baked into the culture in a good way. And I think starting our own shops, really, no one's coming to save us. And I think you're seeing more of that with some of this niche media. The problem is with wealth. And if you look at who historically holds wealth, who holds wealth today in the United States, it's not people of color. Women are underpaid. When the LA Times did their diversity survey, women, same experience level, some of which have Pulitzers, earning 70 cents to the dollar that their male peers are earning. And so I think that we're working in different prongs in different ways. And the fellowships and internships are good, but my concern is that it's creating what has been deemed the internship ghetto back going to 1991 in some studies I read, where like I was a Met Pro. So I was hired at a lower rate, and then, I could never really make it up from there. And so it gets your foot in the door, but you have this label. Like the only reason you're there maybe is because of this. And my friends that were of color that got hired not under the Met Pro label had a very different experience in reception. There was always like I forgot who said that about the Spurs championship, but the asterisk. Like you feel like, is there an asterisk on why I was brought into the LA Times? And so I think that we have to be really cognizant of like, you know what, just hire us. We need insurance. We need the benefits. If you want to keep us around, treat us as an equal. It shouldn't be that you have to do this, the subservient kind of program to bring us in. Because I've gone to, like my Mizzou's class, while it wasn't very racially diverse, which I don't know what your experience was. Okay, yeah. So, one of the reasons I went there is because the aid was so good, and I got a Thurgood Marshall Fellowship. So I did take that money, and hey, like our land was taken, so I'm going to take that money. So I felt like, there are opportunities like that, but when I looked around the class, it was mostly women. I thought, this is really This is really going to change the field. And these women know how to do social media. They know how to write investigative. They know how to do a FOIA. And I'm like, wow, like my colleagues do not know what's coming behind them. And so that's why the Me Too movement is not going away. That's why it's so strong, and that's why we're on the verge of possibly having the Supreme Court, candidate fully derailed. And so we can't underestimate the power of our own voices. And the more we have those dialogues, the more my straight white male editors are like, I didn't think about it that way. It's not as hostile as it needs to seem. But there has to be everyone kind of getting in that space and talking about it. And I'm a journalist, so I'm skeptical to a degree. It has to get worse before it gets better. And I think that that's the moment we're in right now. I don't know how much more worse it's going to get, and that's why I say it's
Worser.
worse. So I'm a little worried about that, but I think you see all these acts of resistance against that that are very encouraging.
Awesome, thank you, Francisco. And Graham, do you have any 30-second quick hopeful so we get into Q&A?
Oh my gosh, so I've told the darkest stories in the room, and like, I don't feel the way she feels. I absolutely did, and since moving over to nonprofit journalism, being involved in, our staff is incredibly diverse. Its leadership is overwhelmingly female, with the exception of our founder, but our COO is a female, and I'm a female as a managing editor, and this number 2 in charge on our business side is a female, and my deputy is a female. I have a lot of really talented female reporters. I have a couple reporters of color who are incredibly talented. One of my 2 photographers is female. It has been an eye-opening experience to me where that journalism is changing, and it's not the way that I perceived it to be, and I don't want this to be an indictment on the Express News, but it can be kind of dark in newsrooms. It can be kind of challenging in newsrooms. And I think that what I've seen in nonprofit news, especially being surrounded by a lot of younger energy, has just been a resurgent feeling for me for journalism as a whole, and seeing that their future, as Francisco noted, is super bright. That the people who are coming out of journalism school, a lot of the pitches that I get from people who want to be contributors or people who want to be freelancers for us are, I would say, 90% women.
Wow.
I rarely get a pitch from a man who wants to write something for us. And so this is wildly encouraging to me that things are changing, and they're changing for the better. And I can say unequivocally in my career that I have never been more encouraged and excited about journalism than I have been in the past 3 months that I've been at the Rivard Report, involved in nonprofit journalism, where you're writing what's important. You're not worried about being beholden to advertisers and page views and all of that nonsense that is bringing journalism down. You are writing stories. And I remember my dad asked me, like, what is your favorite part of your job, after the first few weeks that I was there. And I said, what my favorite part is that I just get to do journalism. That's it. There's no sitting there going, well, we can't run this story over here because it's not going to get enough page views to satisfy X amount of advertisers, or we're not going to make enough money this month, and we're going to have to lay off 14 people because corporate overlords think that we're not turning a large enough profit margin. I don't have to worry about any of that, and it is such a huge weight off of me mentally and physically that I see the nonprofit model, and it's not the small newsrooms. You see some bigger newsrooms going toward a nonprofit model as well, or starting to model their newsrooms after nonprofits, because they see that that is a healthier way to move journalism forward, to not be beholden to corporations or to advertisers, to figure out that there are people who just want you to report good journalism, and they will give you money to do it because that's what they want to see. So I'm a little more inspired by what I've seen in terms of the possibilities that are ahead of us in journalism.
Awesome. And
That's okay, we'll just
good.
go to
Okay,
questions.
so anyone who wants to have the first question to our speakers, if you could stand up, please, and just share with us your question.
And if there's no questions, that's okay.
We were that good, huh?
Awesome.
All right, Jolene.
Yes, you could say your name, please.
So diversity, I mean, you guys know diversity isn't just hiring people of color, it's being able to tap into people of color, their experiences, their expertise in their field. And so many newsrooms, especially corporate newsrooms, having a waterfall style of leadership and editorial discretion. How would you all suggest, or how would you all like management and editors to tap the resources of people of color without pigeonholing them into just writing about you're black, thinking about black communities, or you're Mexican, you're Mexican communities. So how can editors do that in a tactful and smart way?
Well, one of the ways is, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, is to diversify your source list. And newsrooms do this too in various successful and unsuccessful ways. In the way it can be unsuccessful is that you learn of one professor at some university who can answer a question about demography, and that's the same professor that you always call up, that everybody always calls up. But the way you can do it successfully is that everybody buys into, or a great majority of reporters buy into, diversifying your stories. And that's the reason we, the Express News did the Maynard program at the time, was because we knew there was something wrong, but we needed to convince, we needed to be our own disciples and question our source lists and who we were talking to, who we were photographing. So my Rolodex, I have an old-fashioned Rolodex that sits on my desk. There are a couple of other reporters and editors who do that. They're not computerized. And I purposely do that because I leave it open. It can be used by anybody. And if you're looking for someone and you think, I may have Henry Cisneros' cell number, or I may have Ellen Riojas Clark's home number because she answers her home number, or you can go and get it. So I think that's what we need to do for each other, is that we need to share our sources and build more sources and better reflect the community. And nothing works like just shoe leather, going out into places, putting yourself in places that you're not comfortable in. I try to do that with arts events and all sorts of events. I'm like, I'm going to go by myself. But it's a good challenge, and I almost always come away with something. Or what happens to me is people come at me and they give me something and say, we really would like somebody to cover this. Who do I get it to? And then you become the connector to the right reporter.
I think what she said is perfect about shoe leather reporting, getting out of your bubble. I remember one recommendation I got from an editor at the LA Times was like, drive home a different route as often as you can to see different things in the neighborhood. And like we all are, we all have spaces we enter different times where we're uncomfortable. As reporters, like that's like what we're supposed to do all the time. I feel like if you're always in your bubble, you're going to keep going to the same people. And so like I had talked to some of my colleagues about source diversity because we were looking at doing something in one of my publications, and everyone lauds the NPR. And so I pulled this stat because 70% of the sources at the news magazines, Morning Edition, and All Things Considered, quote, are 70% male and 73% white, and 40% come from DC, California, or New York combined. And so Chalkbeat allowed me to come back to San Antonio because they also view that as valuable to them, having my presence here as a Chicano in South Texas. And so I went already to the border this last weekend, and I walked away with better stories that I felt I couldn't get from the reformers I was talking to on the phone. There's very important stories and perspectives I can get from them, but those are mostly upper class, financially white, straight males that I'm talking to about education reform, even though the industry is mostly women. Still, those that have the money make the decisions that we want to cover when we talk about power are of that demographic. So it's important to get out. And then I think as far as what managers can do is take implicit bias training. There's the Maynard Institute offers it. It's done in a lot of journalism conferences. And it's had a resurgence of popularity because we all have implicit bias. And it's when you read a story and two people can read the same story and interpret it differently. I mean, that's something you alluded to. I think the coverage of the police shootings is an example of that, and how it's framed and how we talked about how we talked about the Laquan and we talked about in Ferguson the black youth and the No Angel headline, and that's implicit bias at work in print, and that's our newspaper of record for the country. So I think like encouraging your whole newsroom, because if you just recommend it to one person, you're basically being like, hey, you're kind of racist, or, so maybe like trying to like get the whole newsroom, because we all have it. We all have it, and those of us that consistently go through trauma because of our race or because of sexism or homophobia, you internalize it, and then you start to develop your own bias. And so as journalists, we especially cannot do that. And the last number about the coastal stuff is it really does affect the coverage. And I would always get kind of frustrated in how people would say the middle of the country is all one thing, and that, there are very powerful conservatives in Washington, D.C. and in Los Angeles, and there are a lot of liberal activists here in our backyard. So, like, that's something that I still, with editors on calls, would be like, it's like Texas, there's a lot of things going on with gerrymandering and voter ID laws, and this president narrowly won through the Electoral College. And so, like, it's not as simple as it seems about the Midwest and parts of the country that don't have that voice. And so you have to get out there, send your reporters to those places.
I don't know, yeah.
Awesome. Do we have another question? Yes.
I feel relationships that I've had for women, especially, there's this unspoken push to be pretty, and if you aren't pretty, you're not pleasing the eye enough, you're not attractive enough, you don't get as much good attention from your workers that are bad attention. But and even like, or if a man comes into work looking a little bit rough that day, he's done any hair when he's a slob, or even a coworker suggested to me in New York on a walk of shame. So that kind of thing.
Are you in broadcast or print?
I was in very
I can see that.
yeah.
Well, it happens everywhere. It
Yeah.
happens at the 7-Eleven, it happens at J.C. Penney's, and it happens in newsrooms. And we had an editor, fortunately he's gone off to other things, who was very much focused on that. I always felt that he was casting a show about journalism called The Newsroom rather than hiring for talent. So, thankfully that doesn't happen in my newsroom, but it can happen. And how to combat that? That is what women have been asking for a very long time. I can tell you that every woman experiences this, and you're not alone. I would be careful. I would be careful about invitations from editors. I would be careful about how you conduct yourself. I think what happens with women is that it's all on us. It's our behavior. It's how we dress. It's too much. It's enormous, what is called upon you to do. But you want to be successful, and you want to get a good assignment. You want to get a good beat. You want to get the promotion. You want to get a pay increase. And you have to also live with yourself and what you do and don't do. I always wonder about some of the young women who went through our newsroom and probably did some things that they regret now to get more from their job, to get an opportunity. So I would say learn to live with yourself and police yourself because you can do it with dignity and you can still be professional and you can still have fun at your job. And I've always been the kind of person that's optimistic. I was just talking to Francisco's mom, Dolores, about this, that in spite of all of the things that have happened in the newspaper industry, I find I'm greatly enthusiastic. I still love my job. I still feel like it's such a privilege to call up somebody who doesn't know me, and they will give me time. And they will say, yes, come over, or I'll give you some time over the phone. I mean, what an extraordinary job to have. So I wish you much luck. You can do it. All of us have done it. And you might have some obstacles. You're going to have some tough times. The best way I've always learned to deal with it is to talk to someone who cares about me, talk to a mentor, pick a mentor, ask for help. But we know that it's hard to speak truth to power, especially in a newsroom.
Jennifer is also our managing editor for The Contemporary. Awesome. But do you want to share some news that we're doing soon, Jennifer? If you want to stand up, yeah, that would be great.
Why don't you come to the microphone? So,
Okay. Or there's this one as well.
oh yeah, come up there. There you go. One of the things I also wanted to mention is when we're talking about how there's many more women, that's good. That bodes well. But what I worry about is that fewer men are going into the business because it's not paying well enough. I mean, history has shown us whenever an industry starts to shrink, I mean, secretaries were all men until secretarial work didn't pay enough. Men got out of it. So I worry about that. I worry when we have a workforce that's only women. That's why I'm encouraged by the fact that women are leading the unionization. Newsrooms deserve unions because of the way they're behaving. You don't create a union somewhere because they're already so nice and generous. You create a union because they are needed.
Yeah, I'm Jennifer. Whoa, hi. I'm Jennifer Jessel. I'm the new managing editor for The Contemporary. I just joined on in May, and we've already put out a lot of fun articles, which is really cool. And I'm here to announce that we're starting a podcast. So, yeah. Yeah. So we're probably going to start it on SoundCloud, but we will definitely put it up on our website when we do start it. But our very first episode is actually interviewing Zabdi about her experience with Raices this summer. So we're very excited to show you guys that. And yeah, we're going to try to make it a monthly thing, and we're just super excited about it.
Awesome. Well, thank y'all very much for joining us. If you want to ask a question real quick, yeah, if y'all want to still, listen into the conversation, yeah. And then right after, I guess, we'll conclude our event.
And introduce yourself, because you're so fabulous. Who's also fabulous.
Yeah, they're great.
Which is the name of our business, which ultimately we chose because she sounded like a white girl. As people began to become more comfortable with us, however, we did begin to sign our emails with our real names, Christian and Krishna. However, we did struggle for a very long time, having absolutely zero black clients, sharing stories from Amazon, the Daughters of the Republic, Brooke Stevens, we're getting people to even open our emails. And when we did get people to open our emails, when the question came up, tell me more, it was, how did y'all open this client? Which was
it's loaded
Oh,
with
it's so,
all
yeah.
sorts of things.
I've been an entrepreneur for a very long time, have an extensive history, and the question of how did y'all get this climate really turned out to, it translated to me, how did two black people
Yes, it's
one
horrible.
Nigeria and one Detroit? And I began to struggle with how mainstream stories were shared by diverse persons. So I would like to know, what are you all doing to ensure that your community recognizes that even though someone could be a minority, they can share the mainstream perspective on a number of
Of
topics?
course. And minority journalists, you know, there are a lot of journalists of color who they did not want to do the Latino beat, and they resented being, you know, just because I'm Latino, I'm supposed to be the dictionary of all things Latino. I mean, that's not what I do. I do, you know, urban affairs, or I do politics, or I do county government, or I do medical, and that's where I'm the expert. Come to me with those. So, how do you do it? You take it.
I don't feel like well, at least since I've been there, I can't speak to what's happened prior to, right? But we have a relationship with Bethany East. We've taken stuff from Bethany East, and I think that I don't think we sit there and go, well, this is a black firm, so we're not, we don't feel like they're going to be able to tell a story as well as, you know, whatever other firm over here. At least I hope we don't think that way. I personally don't think that way, nor, I don't also do a ton of research on the places that are pitching us. So that's my ignorance on that. But, I mean, a good story is a good story. And that's the way it should be. It shouldn't matter where the story comes from. It should be, is the story worth pursuing? And so that's how I evaluate every pitch we get, and we get a ton of pitches. I mean, some are good, some are bad, and that's the way with everything. But I think that we evaluate them on the merit of the story, whether this would either A, benefit our readers, serve our mission, and whether or not we can make good journalism out of it. And those are the only criteria I care about. I don't care who pitches it to me. The only things that I care about are those few things right there.
I would say call them out. Maybe I'm a little bit more at that stage of my life, but I think that it's, you know, it's only fair. And I mean, you can call them out in a variety of ways. You know, anything from to their face politely, or go on Twitter rants. I mean, because it's a problem, and it's until we start really talking about it, we're never going to get past it. And I think, you know, as anyone who's professional, like, we know the standards, so it's like it's okay to bring attention to it. I think, you know, when you hear those things, I feel like I would have a really hard time working for a news organization that would do that. And like I said, a lot of times, like, my experiences were really, really coded. And it was almost like that's what made me feel crazy so much of the time. Because I was like, I just know there's something different here in how you're responding to my story ideas, or like why I want to quote certain folks. You know, most of the trauma I dealt with was from readers, like, harassing me. It wasn't so much in the newsroom.
Or
but,
school board members.
Or school board members, which there was a security detail at one point. But like, I felt like, I hear you, and on that end, you need to build relationships with other journalists that are going to understand what you're going through, because we are in a coexisting space. There's a lot of stories I could not do as a journalist without the help of people that do marketing and communications. And I think that we get really high and mighty about that in journalism sometimes. The challenge is that we don't know the baseline of how bad it is. And so NPR is one of the only organizations that even did that study. And, you know, other organizations I know have done it, they don't want to publicly release it because the sources are predominantly not reflective of the communities they're serving or covering. And a lot of times it has to do with who gets in power in those organizations are like, you know, it's a school system that's black, but the superintendent's white. It's almost that kind of situation where it's like you have to quote the superintendent, but there are a ton of black teachers, so why are we not talking to them? And the thing that always sticks in my head that a mentor told me once when I was interviewing them about how they've survived in the field, an older black journalist, he said, black people shovel snow. And that's something that like reporters need to remember, that they don't need to be in the paper when they're always dying or committing a crime. And that like, you know, when we're doing a story on like tax policy, you know, just in your head think, do I have all white men in the story? And there are times though when the demographics around you are gonna dictate what that is. For example, I got a call once when I wrote about Edgewood, which is 97% you know, Latino, and I had a presumably white reader, which I know I shouldn't assume, but it was over the phone, who asked me why I only quoted Latinos in the story. And I said, well, because the school district is 97% Latino, and we were segregated out 50 years ago when SISD didn't want us there. Do you have any further questions? And I feel like you have to like always be armed with that kind of information, but it's about building relationships. Like there are those of us in the institutions, in the media that are also like, I see you, I get you. And that pressure that you were talking about, you feel like if you screw up for like the entire race or the entire gender or the entire gay community. And so we understand more, and it's about building those relationships with journalists you feel like maybe kind of get what your cause is and aren't so high and mighty about having relationships with people in the PR world or the marketing world.
Awesome. Well, that concludes our evening, and thank you all for coming to this insightful conversation. And if we could just also give a round of applause to all of our speakers who gave their time. They've been through so much. So thank you, everyone, and y'all could mingle around, but this is the end of our event. Thank you.
Hi.
Thanks
Yes,
for
no, I know
coming.
you
Did
for
she
Twitter.
drag you here?
Yeah, and
Or
read
did
the
you?
stories. Yeah, of course. Oh my God, I'm looking at myself. I'm like, get me out of this room. Let me. I work right now from my father's house near Ingram Mall.
Good. There were some shots across the back.